the Renaissance. It's a term that we use all the time. It's a term that's now used far beyond a particular period of history, but we really need to explore it. Obviously, there are books and there are courses and whatever on this extraordinary period of European history, first in Italy and then in other places. After all, Shakespeare is a Renaissance writer in England. But we need to look at it in its origins, in its Italian, and in particular in its Florentine context. And in doing that, we're also going to use the word humanist and humanism a lot. So once we understand what's going on culturally in Florence, really beginning in the 14th century and sort of highlighting in the 15th and 16th century, beyond the world of painting, which I'm barely going to mention, then we are going to know the intellectual context in which Machiavelli was born, in which he was raised and educated, and in which he wrote, and to which he was such a contributor. The word Renaissance, ironically, of course, is not an Italian word, but it's a French word. And we all know, we learned this somewhere along the way in school, it is renaissance, it is rebirth, implying that something got born, something died, and something got born again. So we got to figure out first, what is it that got born, died, and got reborn? And secondly, is this an accurate description of what happened culturally and intellectually in Italy, particularly Florence, in the 15th and 16th centuries? One of the mistakes we often make is assuming that if it's the born, died, reborn thing, that means that during the Middle Ages, the great classics of Greek and Roman antiquity must have died out. They must have been put aside. They must have been unused. But of course, that's not so at all. Anybody can tell you that all during the Middle Ages, for example, after all, Latin was the language of learning, Latin was the language of the church, and therefore anything that had ever been written in Latin could have been read by the educated people of the Middle Ages. Even a vernacular poet like Dante, living in the early 14th century, not only could read Latin, he wrote books in Latin as well as writing the Divine Comedy in Italian. So with regard to the Latin classics, in some very real sense, they didn't need to get reborn because, well, they never died. It is important to say, though, that they were used in the Middle Ages, by and large, I'm obviously very much generalizing, in a particular way. The way being that, well, those Latin classics are valuable because, A, we can use them to learn how to write and how to read text in Latin well. And also, if we use them correctly, and especially certain parts of the Latin classics, if we use them rightly, they can lead us toward God, even though they were written by pagans. To put it simply, the classics were an aid, although they were not sufficient in moving people toward God. Again, that the classics were taken seriously, and that they were taken seriously in the context of Christians seeking salvation, is best shown by, again, turning to Dante. After all, through almost two-thirds of Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, for almost two-thirds of that, Dante's guide is a pagan Latin poet, Virgil. And we can see not only that Dante was a serious reader of Virgil, but a serious reader of Ovid and many of the other great Latin classics. In contrast to that, let's talk about the works of Greek antiquity in the Middle Ages. Now, we're not going to talk about the Byzantine Empire centered in Constantinople because, of course, that was a Greek-speaking empire, and they continued to read the Greek classics as the Latin classics were read in the West. But the knowledge of Greek, although it never disappeared in the West in the Middle Ages, almost did so. And therefore, for most of the Middle Ages, the only Greek works that were known directly in the West were those which had been translated, or parts had been translated, into Latin in ancient times. There were, throughout the Middle Ages, little snippets of Aristotle and other Greek writers that existed in the West. But by and large, the body of Greek literature that we first think of today, we think of Homer, we think of the plays of Sophocles, we think of the great historian Thucydides, we think of Plato. By and large, not entirely, by and large, that body of material was not directly known in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Now, Dante knew all about Homer in some ways. He knew the plots of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He even knew that Homer was the greatest poet who had ever lived. But he'd never read Homer. He'd read summaries of Homer in Latin. He read references to Homer in various classical works. He even read a few lines of Homer that had been translated into Latin and incorporated into various Latin works. But Homer, he had never read Homer at all. Now, in the 12th century, the writings of Aristotle, by and large, in the form we have them today, were translated into Latin. By the way, not directly from the Greek, but through Arabic. But what's important to know is there was this revival of Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas, his writings, theological and philosophical, are unimaginable without both the knowledge of Aristotelian logic and the content of Aristotle's thought. And Dante, well, he was so familiar with Aristotle that he simply could call him the philosopher. He didn't even need to give a name. So Aristotle, and generally speaking, works of Greek science, were translated into Latin in the 12th century. And so that's what exists. I want to point out one specific thing about Aristotle. And that is, we need to remember that Aristotle wrote logic, about logic. He wrote a lot of things that we would call science today. But he also wrote books on ethics, and he wrote a book on the politics. And therefore, Aristotle's political and ethical thought became a central part of the Western tradition again, beginning in the 13th century. So, in many ways, what we need to remember is that by the beginnings of the Renaissance, sometime in the 14th century in Italy, and in Florence in particular, the Latin classics had always been around, but relatively few of the Greek classics were available at that time. And we're going to see how things change. Now, let me turn to another one of those terms we need to define, and that term is humanist or humanism. Let me start with this. Humanism is not a word that was used in the Renaissance. This is always a problem. Historians are constantly struggling to deal with the fact that words that have come into modern English usage to describe phenomena in the periods they study are words that have been created in modern times. Gothic architecture, feudalism, those are modern terms. So is humanism. I'm going to use it because it is convenient, but we need to know that that word is made up by scholars writing about the Renaissance, not by the participants, if you will. But they did talk about humanists and the study of the humanities. And that really is what we want to talk about. If you take a look at a broad general survey of the history of the West, one of the things you will probably read is sometime in the 14th century, we get the beginnings of this new interest in the humanities, in the classics, and the figure that we usually use to personify the beginnings of that is Petrarch, an Italian who lived a good deal of his adulthood in France because the papacy was located in Avignon at that time. He died in 1374, and he's sometimes described as the first humanist. Scholars today have been working on this question of the origins of humanist thought. See, one can avoid saying humanism if one really tries. And what they found is that, in fact, there are at least people we want to call proto-humanists that go back generations before Petrarch. And in fact, there is one scholar who has called Petrarch a third-generation humanist. These earlier humanists, or sometimes called proto-humanists, are not necessarily and not often Florentines. Padua is an important university city and a place where we now look for some of the origins of this new interest in, concern for, and use of the writings of ancient Greece and Rome. One of the most popular and interesting theories about the triumph of humanists as the dominant educational program of the ruling class in Florence is by a scholar named Hans Baron. And Hans Baron said, I can trace almost to the year when humanists thought this new look at the classics became dominant in Florence. It occurred right following Florence's victory over Milan in 1402 with the death of the ruler of Milan, Gian Galeazzo Visconti. It's very interesting because Milan was about to beat the hell out of Florence. Florence was not doing well, and in this sort of great crisis that Florence faced, Gian Galeazzo died. And Milan had to withdraw. And then about a decade later, the Florentines were in a similar kind of situation with the king of Sicily, who was located in Naples at that time. And so the Florentines began to see the triumph of Republican Florence over the monarchy or a kind of dictatorship in southern Italy and in Milan. And hooray for the Republic, and hooray for Republican values, and hooray for the intrinsic superiority of our Republican type of society and form of government. And how do you learn best how to praise republics? You go back and read the praises and the writings about republic that existed in the ancient world, in particular, of course, the ancient Roman Republic. And therefore, in a sense, the classics, the argument is, had a kind of immediacy, a kind of rhetorical immediacy, a kind of theoretical immediacy in Florence because of Florence at a self-proclaimed Republican triumph over the bad guys. However much their triumph was at least as much a matter of luck as virtue or military power. Now, in recent years, there are scholars who have said it's not quite that one-to-one, the triumph of humanist thought and the victory of Florence over Gian Galeazzo Visconti. And so this is something scholars argue about, and the arguments are interesting. But at least suffice it to say that in the early 15th century, what begins perhaps as an intellectual movement of very limited scope becomes a much broader intellectual movement, a new interest in and use for the writings of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And if one says, boy, is this stuff relevant, boy, is this stuff useful to us here in Florence, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to reread books that have been read for a long, long time from a new perspective. And you're going to go hunt for books that might exist, that you don't know exist, but that probably exist. And so that's exactly what happens. We begin a kind of hunt for new writings of favorites like Cicero, and a few things turned up. You have people going into monasteries and sort of blowing the dust off the shelf and saying, gosh, here's a manuscript that hasn't been looked at for a long time. Let's see what's in it. By golly, there's a new letter of Cicero we didn't know about before. So there were some discoveries of the Latin classics, but there was also a real interest in finding Greek classics because they weren't very well known directly, even though they knew their existence. They knew about them. And so if you're interested in writing about and talking about and orating about and writing letters about and living as free people in a city-state, well, you know, those damn Greeks had something to say about that stuff too, especially the Athenians. And so there became a new interest in learning Greek, finding Greek text, and getting those Greek texts translated into Latin, although learning Greek was the ideal. And so what we begin to have is literally a rediscovery of some Greek stuff and a little bit of Latin stuff. But much more, we begin to get a whole new way of thinking. Let me go back now and review a little bit more the way that people at the end of antiquity, Christians, and the early Middle Ages thought about the classics, so we can see not just that that's going to continue, but that something new with regard to the use of classics is going to be added. If we go all the way back to St. Augustine, who wrote his Confessions in the year 397, it is very clear, he makes it unambiguous. Reading Cicero and reading Platonic philosophy were important events in his ultimate conversion to Christianity. But Augustine also warns his readers in many of his works, you got to be real careful to understand what the classics can't do for you. Useful, but not sufficient. As Augustine says in Book 7 of the Confessions, I really needed the Platonists to get me over some problems in my thinking, but no pagan philosopher can take me to God because Christ is the only way to God for fallen humanity. Again, therefore, the classics are useful, and certain pieces, more than other pieces, I might add, are useful in the journey toward God, but not all, and not for their own sake. They're not there for entertainment. They're not there as works to be looked at simply in and of themselves. They are things written by wise men that can lead us toward the ultimate wisdom, which is the wisdom of the Christian God. And in the 13th century, in the 1200s, Thomas Aquinas, again, uses Aristotle. He uses Aristotelian logic, and he uses the content of Aristotle for much of his moral thought and much of his categorization of ethical thought, as well as a lot of Aristotle's science. Dante's cosmology in the Divine Comedy is essentially Aristotle's cosmology. So again, to emphasize, a lot of the classics were very valuable to thinkers throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, so what's new? What's new in the 15th century? How are people reading Cicero anew? Why do they find it so interesting to go find works of Plato and Thucydides? Well, even though I said earlier that probably we shouldn't count Petrarch as the first humanist, I nevertheless want to look to him, living in the middle of the 14th century, as sort of emblematic of what we're talking about here. Petrarch wrote a letter to Cicero. It's a very interesting thing to do because, among other things, Cicero had been dead for 1,400 years. Obviously, he didn't sit by the mailbox waiting for a response. But he wrote a letter to Cicero because he so was taken by what Cicero says and the beauty of Cicero's Latin prose. He felt a certain kind of commonness with him that bridged that 1,400-year gap between them, a kind of intimacy with Cicero. Another thing that Petrarch did, he writes about this in a famous letter, he climbed a mountain in France, Mont Ventoux, not too far from Avignon. Why? He said, because I was reading Livy, the great historian of the Roman Republic. I was reading Livy one day, and in one of Livy's texts, Livy talks about a general who climbed to the top of a mountain and surveys all around him. And Petrarch said, I wanted to have that same experience that general had. And so I decided I'd climb a mountain in imitation. I'm doing it because it's there and because I'm inspired to learn something and experience something right now. I'm inspired to do that from one of these great classical texts. That passage in Livy just really floated my boat. It turned me on. It got me excited. And so I set out to climb this mountain in France to have a parallel experience to what's described in Livy. That begins to give us a hint of something new about the way the classics speak to us. Not as, if I read this piece, this might intellectually prepare me for a better reading of the Bible, although they didn't reject that in the Renaissance, but rather I'm going to do this because I'm inspired to imitate. And I'm so bound up with the experience that's recorded in some of these classical texts. Again, the letter to Cicero that Petrarch wrote, that I really feel a kind of kinship. I feel like there's a way in which we can communicate. I think Petrarch is sort of saying in writing this letter, there's an identity that really goes around that 1,400-year time gap and links us together. Now, to say the obvious, and I've said it before, Rome, before the time of Julius Caesar, was a republic. Florence was a republic. And therefore, especially in kind of the Florentine Republican, and I use this word without any bad connotations, propaganda that began to develop, especially after the defeat of Milan in 1402, these classical authors were directly relevant. They helped to structure our experience in Florence. They helped us to express our experience. They helped us in our diplomatic correspondence, the Latinity of Cicero and others, as well as the content. And so there was, not just in an individual like Petrarch, but really at the beginning of the 15th century, with the elite of the Florentine Republic, there was a real sense that these guys, these ancient writers, and we are really sharing experiences. We're on a common page. Of course there are differences. Of course we're not the ancient Roman Republic, but we were founded, Florence was, in ancient Roman times. It is our rightful heritage, and there is a real sense of the new experience of republicanism that could be understood, furthered, and expressed by using these classics. Also, what we need to appreciate is, if you read Cicero, you say, okay, Cicero might help me get to heaven. Helped Augustine get to heaven. Pretty good. But you know what Cicero also does? Cicero really helps me live better in this world. I'm a better citizen. I'm a better speech maker. I'm a better letter writer. Cicero wrote lots and lots of letters. I may even be a better friend because Cicero wrote a book on friendship. In other words, without ever dismissing the more medieval notion that reading some Cicero might help me get to heaven, what you have happening at the beginning of the Renaissance is people saying, yeah, but Cicero is also valuable in and for himself because he makes my life right here on earth right now more successful, better, more pleasant. And therefore, it's really that new sense of the classics as valuable, not just in helping me to attain life in heaven, but helping me to live this life well and prosperously and happily and knowledgeably and all the rest of it. And therefore, instead of seeing the classics as, a help, maybe even an indirect help to get to heaven, it is, in fact, a body of literature that's valuable for its own sake. And here's the main idea I want to focus on, and that is that what we begin to have developing in the Renaissance is that there is an autonomous realm of ethics in the world. I can read the classics because I enjoy them and because they make me a little bit happier and better here and now, and that's sufficient. It isn't all they might do for me, I've said that before, but it's sufficient. That's a good enough reason for reading Cicero, because Cicero can make me a better public speaker, a better friend, a better citizen, a better letter writer. Remember, Florentines of the elite class were on the move a lot. They travel outside of Italy as well as within Italy, working for the various banks, serving as diplomats. Machiavelli went to France. Machiavelli went to the Holy Roman Empire in what we would call Germany today, writing letters, writing reports, if you're working for the government or for a business, are a very important part of that. Cicero and the other Latin writers give me a way to do that better. So to Cicero for executives, Cicero for government officials, and so on. And so what's argued is not, again, I can't say this enough because it's important for us when we're looking at Machiavelli. But it's not that you dismiss the Christian or religious value of these classics, but you say they have a value in and of themselves that is at least in principle divorceable from that. There is an autonomous realm of living and acting and being thoughtful about moral choices that is not in and of itself simply aimed toward heaven, but it works in the here and now. As I said, this not only leads to an intense new reading of Latin classics that have been around and finding a few new pieces here and there, it led to a new desire for Greek writing. And so we find the study of Greek in Florence, and, big break, in 1453, the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople falls to the Turks. And a lot of Christian writers, intellectuals, church officials leave Constantinople and come to the West, in particular to Italy, sometimes bringing their books, but bringing their knowledge of Greek with them. There are situations we know of in Florence where a group of merchants would get together on an evening with a Greek who had emigrated from the Byzantine Empire who could teach them Greek, and they would sit and read a Greek text together. And so the rediscovery of so many Greek works, the works of Plato, and one I want to focus on for just a second, the writings of Thucydides. The history of the Peloponnesian War today has sort of the reputation of being the best damned history book ever written. And I would agree with that, by the way. He's at the top of my list of the world's greatest historical thinkers. I've always wondered, I sure wish Dante would have had Thucydides around because he could have found some really neat inhabitants of hell in there. But he didn't have Thucydides around. But Thucydides not only comes to the West, but it's translated into Latin in the early 15th century. And so there's a whole body of political material, stories and analysis that Machiavelli will make use of. Machiavelli, by the way, never learned Greek. But he did have a lot of the Greek classics, works of Plato, Thucydides, in Latin. And therefore, he had a bigger view of antiquity than somebody living a century earlier who would not have known Greek and would not have had those texts available. And remember, too, that along comes the printing press in the middle of the 15th century. And one of the things that means is that with the printing press, this is really cool, right? You can have books that are fairly inexpensive in Latin. In fact, as I'll talk about in the next lecture, one of the things we will discover is that Thucydides' dad, we know, wrong guy, Machiavelli's dad, don't know about Thucydides' dad, Machiavelli's dad had a copy of the first 10 books of Livy. Printed copy. He got it for free, probably couldn't have afforded it, because he did the index. And that's sort of sitting around the Machiavelli household when little Niccolò is growing up. Let me make one more point about Renaissance humanist thought. We very often divide it into two periods and categories. The first period, roughly the first half of the 15th century, we refer to civic humanism. That is to say, we talk about the fact that the classics are seen primarily as they apply to political and social life. They are practical, useful, and applicable. But in the second half of the 15th century, there is a movement, in some sense, in a different direction, symbolized by the fact that Lorenzo de' Medici, again, he ruled from 1469 to 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici founded a Platonic academy in Florence. And that suggests, therefore, more of a philosophical and contemplative interest in the classics. So we usually talk about a shift from civic humanism to a more contemplative, philosophical humanism that takes place in institutions like the Platonic Academy in Florence. However, and this is the key point I want to make at the end, Machiavelli, although he lives at the end of the 15th and in the 16th century, really is much more a civic humanist. He's not a guy who wants to sit around and talk about ideas in Plato. He's a guy who wants to take Livy and Cicero and these others and say, how can they inform us about the way the world really works? How can they teach us things to avoid? How can they give us guidelines to help us do better by contrasting their successes with our failures? And so in many ways, although a little bit out of time, Machiavelli can be classified as a civic humanist. And with that, we're ready to turn next to the biography of Niccolò Machiavelli.